According to Rabbinic Judaism, the oral Torah or oral law represents those laws, statutes, and legal interpretations that were not recorded in the 5 books of Moses, the written Torah, but nonetheless are regarded by Orthodox Jews as prescriptive and co-given. This holistic Jewish code of conduct encompasses a wide swath of ritual, worship, God-man and interpersonal relationships. From dietary laws to Sabbath and festival observance to marital relations, agricultural practices, and civil claims and damages. According to Jewish tradition, the oral Torah was passed down orally in an unbroken chain from generation to generation until its contents were finally committed to writing, following the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE, when Jewish civilization was faced with an existential threat. The major repositories of the Oral Torah are the Mishnah, compiled between 200–220 CE by Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, and the Gemara, a series of running commentaries and debates concerning the Mishnah, which together are the Talmud, the preeminent text of Rabbinic Judaism. In fact, 2 versions of the Talmud exist. One produced in Jerusalem c. 300–350 CE, and second, more extensive Talmud compiled in Babylonia and published c. 450–500 CE. Belief that the oral Torah was transmitted orally from God to Moses on Mount Sinai during the Exodus from Egypt is a fundamental tenet of faith of Orthodox Judaism, and was recognized as one of the 13 principles of faith by Maimonides. However, not all branches of Rabbinic Judaism accept the divine provenance of the Oral Torah, such that conservative and Reform Jews give deference to the Talmudist sages while empowering themselves to formulate and adopt their own rulings and interpretations. There have also been historical dissenters to the Oral Torah in its entirety, including adherents to Karaite Judaism, who attempt to derive their religious practice strictly from the written Torah, using Scripture's most natural meaning to form their basis of Jewish law. Components. The term, Oral Torah, should not be understood as a monolith. The Jewish Encyclopedia divides the Oral Torah into 8 categories, ranked according to the relative level of authoritativeness, which are found within the Talmud, the 2 Sefer and the Halakhic Midrashim. As aside, the regulations, observances, and statutes included in the last 3 groups were not considered equal in validity to the written law, but were regarded merely as rabbinical regulations. Historical development, source and transmission. According to modern scholarship, the traditions embodied in what later became known as the Oral Torah developed over generations among the inhabitants of Judea and were passed down through various modes of cultural transmission, including but not restricted to oral transmission. It is hypothesized that, sometime prior to the Babylonian exile of 586–530 BCE, in applying the Mosaic Code to daily life and temple worship, a multitude of usages arising out of practical necessity or convenience or experience became part of the routine of observance of the code, and, in the course of time, shared the sanctity and authority which were inherent in the divinely inspired code itself. Such practices experienced exponential growth from the time of Ezra to the Romans' destruction of the Second Temple due to the changing social and religious conditions experienced by inhabitants of Judea. Many of these practices were advocated by the Pharisees, a sect of largely lower and middle-class Jews who stood in opposition to the Sadducees, the priestly caste who dominated the temple cult. The Sadducees rejected the legitimacy of any extra-biblical law or tradition, as well as increasingly popular notions such as the immortality of the soul and divine intervention. Danby notes the following: "It is a reasonable hypothesis that a result of this controversy, a controversy which continued for 2 centuries, was a deliberate compilation and justification of the unwritten tradition by the Pharisee party, perhaps unsystematic and on a small scale in the earlier stages, but stimulated and fostered from time to time both by opposition from the Sadducees and by internal controversy within the ranks of the Pharisees. culminating in the collections of traditional laws from which the present Mishnah draws its material. With the destruction of the Second Temple around 70 CE, the Sadducees were divested of their main source of authority, without which their theology could not survive. On the other hand, the Pharisees became the progenitor of the rabbinic class, who formalized the traditions of their predecessors. Following the fall of the temple, it appears that the Pharisaic leader Yohanan ben Zakkai established himself in Yavneh, where he established a school that came to be regarded by fellow Jews as the successors of the Jerusalem Sanhedrin. Upon this council of Yavneh fell the duty of administering and interpreting religious law, conserving tradition, and solving problems that arose by the past dependence of numerous observances on the existence of the temple and priesthood. Thus, from 70 to 130 CE, when the Bar Kokhba revolt further decimated the Jewish community, the oral law experienced a significant period of development and an unprecedented level of legal and religious authority among the populace. Codification. The Mishnah. The destruction of the Second Temple and the fall of Jerusalem in the 1st and early 2nd centuries CE devastated the Jewish community. The First Jewish-Roman War of 6673 CE and the Bar Kokhba revolt cost more than 1 million Jewish lives, the destruction of leading yeshivot, and thousands of scholars and students. At that point, it became apparent that the Hebrew community and its learning were threatened, and that publication was the only way to ensure that the law could be preserved. Thus, around 200 CE, a redaction of oral law in writing was completed. Both rabbinic tradition and scholarship ascribe this effort to Rabbi Judah HaNasi. The product of this effort, the Mishnah, is generally considered the first work of rabbinic literature. Mishnah is the name given to the 63 tractates that HaNasi systematically codified, which in turn are divided into 6 orders, unlike the Torah, in which, for example, laws of the Sabbath are scattered throughout the books of Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. All the Mishnah laws of the Sabbath are located in a single tractate called Shabbat. Moreover, the laws contained in the 24 chapters that make up that tractate are far more extensive than those contained in the Torah, reflecting the extensiveness of the oral law. Some authorities suggest HaNasi made use of as many as 13 separate collections of halachot from different schools and time periods, and reassembled that material into a coherent whole, arranged it systematically, summarized discussions, and in some cases rendered his own rulings where alternative traditions existed. However, Jacob Neusner argues that the Mishnah does far more than expound upon and organize the biblical commandments. Rather, important topics covered by the Mishnah rest on no scriptural foundations whatsoever, such as portions of the civil law tractates of Bava Kama, Bava Metzia and Bava Batra. In other words, to perfect the written Torah, the oral tradition had to provide for a variety of transactions left without any law at all in Scripture, just as portions of the Torah reflect the agenda of the Levite priesthood in centralizing worship in the temple in Jerusalem and legitimizing their exclusive authority over the sacrificial cult. So too can the Mishnah be seen as reflecting the unique program of the Tannaim and their successors to develop an egalitarian form of Judaism with an emphasis on social justice and an applicability throughout the Jewish diaspora. As a result, the Talmud often finds the rabbis combing scripture for textual support to justify existing religious practice, rather than deriving the practice organically from the language of scripture. The Gemara HaNasi's method of codification, in which he often included minority viewpoints and citation by name to rabbis who championed different viewpoints, became a template for the Gemara, a compendium of discussions and commentaries on the Mishnah's laws by generations of leading rabbis during the next 4 centuries in the two centers of Jewish life, Judea and Babylonia. The Gemara with the Mishnah came to be edited together into compilations known as the Talmud. Both the Babylonian Talmud and the Jerusalem Talmud have been transmitted in written form to the present day. Although the more extensive Babylonian Talmud is widely considered to be more authoritative, the Talmud's discussions follow the order of the Mishnah, although not all tractates are discussed. Generally, a law from the Mishnah is cited, which is followed by a rabbinic deliberation on its meaning. The discussion often, but not always, results in a decision regarding the more persuasive or authoritative position based on available sources or anecdotal evidence. Archaeologists have uncovered evidence relating to religious rituals and practices current, prior to the codification of the Mishnah, from which it can be inferred that Judah HaNasi and his contemporaries recorded, rather than innovated, normative Judaism as authentically practiced during the 1st century CE and prior. For example, excavations at Qumran have yielded specimens of tefillin and parchment scrolls. Likewise, the structure and placement of mikveh ritual baths at the Judean fortress of Masada appears to be consistent with the rabbinic requirements per the Mishnah. Each tractate mikveot, but was constructed approximately 120 years before the Mishnah was compiled. A clay seal discovered in Jerusalem in 2011 is consistent with the tradition recorded in Tractate Sheklim chapter 5. The Elephantine papyri for 19 BCE include a Passover letter, which already included many of the Pesach observances of today. Among the papyri is the first known text of a ketubah from about 440 BCE. The Halachik letter, which records approximately a dozen disputes regarding the application of halachah, also testifies to the evolutionary process of the oral law. Similarly, the Targum Onkelos is largely consistent with the oral tradition as recorded in the Midrash, redacted into writing only in the 3rd or 4th century.